Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's event about 12 things every marketer should know to plan a company anniversary. My name is Brittany Gellerman, the event producer for History Factory's Anniversary Marketing Summit, and I'm joined by my colleague and today's presenter, Jason Dressel. History Factory is a company that uses history to create authentic content for world-leading brands. Each year, our agency presents the Anniversary Marketing Summit, a day-long conference focused on bringing together marketing leaders from across all industries for a day of learning and insights on all things related to company anniversaries. In the next hour, you'll learn tips and insights on how to develop and implement a successful anniversary campaign, from examples of how leading organizations have done it themselves. Before we begin, I want to give you some tips on how to get the most out of today's presentation. You can submit questions at any time through the chat window on the right side. They'll be shared with our moderator, and all questions will be addressed both in a middle Q&A and at the end of our presentation. Be on the lookout for a few audience polls as we want to gauge the room. Polls will appear on the right side of the platform. Please select your answer and click Submit. Lastly, this platform best performs on Google Chrome. If at any time you have any visual or audio issues, try refreshing your web browser or try a different web browser. We also recommend you close down any other tabs or programs you may have open on your computer. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Jason Dressel. Jason, the Managing Director of History Factory and the Executive Director of the Anniversary Marketing Summit, has been with the agency for almost 2 decades. He has worked with dozens of companies to help them focus on their anniversary goals to develop and implement anniversary campaigns across all industries. For today's agenda, we'll start with a poll so we can get a chance to know you and understand where you're at in the anniversary process. Once we have a better sense of our audience, Jason will dive into explaining what exactly are the Gumbo model and the anniversary framework and 12 things every marketer should know to plan an anniversary campaign. We'll have a Q&A intermission halfway through the presentation. After that, we'll provide key takeaways, additional resources, and end with a Q&A session to address any questions you may have. With that, I'll let Jason take it away.
Thanks, Britt, and thanks to all of you who have logged in to join us today. We've had quite a turnout, which I suppose means that either A, there's been a big drop in your workload and you're hanging out on random webinars to fill your day while you eat your lunch, or B, more likely your company is coming up on an anniversary milestone and you're looking to learn more and get more insights. So regardless of which camp you're in, we hope this session is valuable and you're going to get your money's worth. So to get started, we'd like to first get a sense of who our audience is today. So for those of you who are with us because your company is coming up on an anniversary, if you could use the poll feature to share with us when your company or brand has its anniversary. Is your anniversary next year, in 2020, or 2021 or later?
Great, thanks, Jason. We'll give everyone a few moments to respond. Great. Looks like answers are still rolling in a bit. Awesome. We're going to close the poll now.
Okay, interesting. So 43% of our participants today have an anniversary next year, which is only 7 weeks away. And about 27% are in 2020 and 27% are in 2021 or later. So we've got about almost half of the group today have their anniversaries next year, and then the other half in 2020, 2021 or later. Great. So next, and please be honest and remember that you're anonymous for this process. Share with us how you're feeling about where you are in the anniversary process. Are you super excited and fired up? Are you excited about the opportunity, but maybe apprehensive about where you are in the process or the impact it has on your workload? Or are you frankly just not that psyched at all and would really prefer not to have this on your plate?
Great. We have responses rolling in.
Okay, so we've got about half the group is excited but nervous about it's going up and down, and only about 20% of you feel like you didn't duck fast enough. So that's not bad. But hopefully, no matter where you are on this spectrum, we're going to arm you today with some insights to get you feeling even more confident and excited about what we hope is going to be a fun and rewarding project, not just for your organization, but for you personally. Okay, so let's jump into it. Britt mentioned before what we call the gumbo model. So I will explain to you this delicious metaphor. Now, if you're like most of our clients, there's a real interest in learning what other organizations have done for their anniversaries. And there's a lot of value in putting in the time to learn that, but there's also a lot of familiarity and common ingredients that almost all anniversary programs have. And for that reason, we compare anniversaries to gumbo, which I didn't know until preparing this presentation is actually the official state cuisine of Louisiana. So if you learn nothing else today, I give you that. But gumbo is a common dish that always starts with a meat or shellfish stock, and then what is called in Cajun cooking the Holy Trinity, which is onions, celery, and bell peppers. But after that, no one prepares gumbo the same way. They mix in their own tastes and their own cultures. And anniversaries are kind of the same way. You typically have a holy trinity of ingredients, but the best anniversaries, like the best gumbos, have their own unique spin to make them unique and relevant. So hopefully some of the insights we give you today are going to help you all to make your anniversary gumbo. The other thing that Britt mentioned as part of the setup is what we call our anniversary framework. And we use this framework to help our clients break down the core components of an anniversary. And so many of the things that we talk about today will fall into one of these four areas. So I'll just quickly introduce you to this framework. You're also, after the session today, going to receive in your inbox a workbook that's organized around this framework. It's our take-home planning tool, which you can refer to as well. But the four components of the anniversary framework, which we find is helpful for people to begin to kind of get their heads wrapped around all of the different elements of an anniversary, begins with what we call vision and alignment, which is quite simply, what is it that we're trying to accomplish, and how do we get everybody on board with that vision? The second category, which we're going to talk a lot about today, is this notion of content and access. Do we have the right content? Do we have access to the right kinds of stories that we want to tell that is going to deliver on our vision? And the third area is then what we call the creative expression, which is really how you make the anniversary unique to your organization. What are the tactics, the theme, the graphic identity? How do we make it really feel congruent to your culture, to your brand? And then the fourth area is then the implementation. Obviously, you know, the resources, the planning, the budgeting, all the things that you need to be able to pull off planning and implementing an anniversary. Many of you work in large global organizations, and so there's a number of different components to consider, and we'll talk about that. So in the spirit of helping you make your own anniversary gumbo, I'm going to share, as previously advertised in your inboxes, the 12 things that every marketer should know. And we're going to start with one that may make those of you who just confessed that your anniversary is just weeks away in 2019 cringe a little bit. But the truth is, the longer you wait, the more challenging your anniversary can be and the less opportunities you may have. So to you 2019 folks, don't leave. I promise it's going to get better. But we do want to emphasize that if you're in a position that you can begin planning early, then do it. And don't take my word for it. Every year when we host our Anniversary Marketing Summit event in Chicago, starting early is a piece of advice that every one of our speakers emphasizes. Now, that's not to say that you can't still have a great anniversary if you start last minute. Jack Daniels put their 150th anniversary campaign together just weeks and months before the year began. But it wasn't easy, as our friend Jamie Butler attests here. And Karen Kozak, who spearheaded Cargill's 150th anniversary, also emphasized that starting early is especially important for managing up. Our point of view is that most organizations want to begin planning in earnest 2 to 3 years out. So if you're somewhere in that neighborhood, it's good to get started. As important as planning early is having a reason to leverage your anniversary beyond just saying happy birthday to yourself. So the second thing we want to emphasize is aligning your anniversary with business objectives. And this may sound obvious to you, but we repeatedly find that really smart and sophisticated marketers and communicators working with some of the most admired companies and brands in the world ditch a lot of marketing 101 best practices when it comes to anniversaries. They tend to get very tactical very quickly. but the best anniversaries use the milestone to effectively propel efforts that the organization is already engaged in to move it forward. A great example of this is Stanley Black & Decker, who had their 175th anniversary this year. And one of the major initiatives at Stanley Black & Decker this year was the organization was rolling out a new purpose initiative. I'm sure many of you have probably engaged in a planning and rollout of a corporate purpose in the last few years. And for Stanley Black & Decker, this is a company working in a rapidly consolidating industry that has made over 100 acquisitions over the last 15 years or so. And creating this unifying purpose is important as they continue to grow the business and unify everyone under one global culture. And so their purpose became for those who make the world. And so as part of the anniversary planning, they wanted to reinforce this messaging that they had around the purpose. And so internally, they used the anniversary to create a messaging which was times change, our purpose hasn't. And externally, they simply added on the since 1843 onto the for those who make the world tagline. So you can see how this began to then be creatively executed in their internal communications as well as in their external communications. So we've learned that when you align your anniversary with organizational objectives and you execute well, anniversaries tend to perform very well. We routinely hear from clients about how their anniversary was so well received, how it had the highest levels of participation they've ever seen, or set a new gold standard for their events, or inspired new approaches for how they engage their markets. But a challenge is that they're rarely measured well. So one thing to think about is engineering metrics into your planning and process. I'm sure many of you might say that the demand and expectation for data is one of the biggest changes in your jobs over the last few years. So creating some reasonable, measurable goals with some baselines is something to strive for, even if the anniversary is dovetailing with other marketing or communications initiatives that you have going on concurrently. When Discover Financial turned 25, they had a lot of challenges at the time. A lot of changes were occurring in the organization, and morale had become a real issue for the organization. So they approached their 25th anniversary with a very strong internal focus. And as part of the planning process, they put in place target metrics of achieving at least 75% in a number of categories. And the anniversary actually exceeded that goal. The chief communications officer turned the anniversary into a case study that she presented at several corporate communications conferences. And having baseline metrics and then being able to measure how they were able to move the needle was huge for them and validated what they did to help the 25th move the organization forward. Speaking of metrics and measurement, a lot of companies will have a PR goal and they'll want to use the anniversary as a platform to change perception or increase awareness. And when they're talking about their media hook, we'll ask them, what do you see as the story? And they'll typically say, well, we're turning 25 or 100 or whatever. And we'll say, no, that's not really the message or the story. The anniversary is just the excuse. The media doesn't really care if you're turning 25 or 100. You have to have a story behind that opportunity. So on the occasion of your 25th or 100th, you're then doing something and telling a story. So one of the most critical and quite frankly difficult tasks of an anniversary is building what we call a diversified portfolio of authentic content that is aligned with your audiences, your messaging, and your theme. And I'll come back to that notion of theme in a moment. But based on your audiences and messaging, you have to have stories that resonate and emotionally connect with your audiences. You can't treat your history just as a timeline with a bunch of facts and figures. You have to turn it into a story. One of the great examples of this was Lockheed Martin's Centennial. At the time of the anniversary, the company was going through a brand repositioning. Defense spending globally had diminished, and the organization was pivoting to a brand proposition that was broader and more focused on the broader aviation and aerospace industries. And they really wanted to reinforce and emphasize their capabilities and their track record of success in civilian and commercial aviation. And so their tagline, their new positioning was Accelerating Tomorrow. And they used the anniversary as a way to help propel forward that new positioning with 100 years of Accelerating Tomorrow. And they created this story bank that was organized around key pillars of the brand and created these 100 stories that literally became the fuel of their anniversary campaign. They used it in advertising, they used it in their social media, they used it in their internal communications, they used it in a publication they created. And it was a very effective program at helping accelerate, pun intended, the adoption of their new positioning. The ad campaign won several awards, as did the publication. So it was a great job of how they were able to use stories to garner media, both paid and earned. So in these examples I've shared with Lockheed, with Accelerating Tomorrow, and Stanley Black & Decker with their new purpose to be there for the makers of the world, these are examples where the anniversary echoed messaging that were already being rolled out across these enterprises. But in some cases, there isn't a new tagline to piggyback onto. And this is where that notion of theme that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago comes into play. Creating a theme and a visual vocabulary for the anniversary that ties everything together is really, really important. And the trick to do this well, in our opinion, is to create a theme that is authentic to your organization. We discourage themes like celebrating 25 years or 50 years of service or 75 years of innovation. Literally anyone can say that. So the trick is we want to try to find a theme that is really authentic and is highly ownable by your organization. When Sherwin-Williams turned 150, the company actually looked back at the address that its founder, Henry Sherwin, gave on the occasion of the company's 50th. And he shared his motto, which was, quote, "What is worth doing is worth doing well." And that sentiment struck the right chord of what they wanted to reinforce to their current audiences. It was relevant whether you were an employee in their home office, in a paint store, or on-site with one of their OEM customers, or a painting contractor that uses their products and services. So Sherwin-Williams used this overarching theme of what is worth doing well to tie together a pretty big program that encompassed everything from video to events to product promotions and digital content to employee engagement to community volunteering. And in the spirit of Mr. Sherwin's motto that what is worth doing well, I'll share that anniversaries are a great time to follow that old adage of do a few things and do them well. We often find that organizations spend a disproportionate amount of time figuring out what they're going to do, but not necessarily enough time doing them in a way that is truly thoughtful and substantive. So remember, anniversaries are like gumbo. The ingredients or the tactics aren't what make them different or special. What's key is how you make them your own and congruent to your culture and brand. And no one did this better than IBM for their centennial. Not dissimilar to the approach that Lockheed Martin took. They examined their 100 years of history and heritage, and they compiled 100 stories that were what they called icons of progress. And they created these stories that, again, like Lockheed, kind of became the fuel to their anniversary program. And they even took a unique approach with their theming and graphic identity. So they kind of played off of that iconic IBM brand and logo and created 100 unique logos for the anniversary, each one reinforcing one of those 100 stories. They took those 100 stories and it became the foundation of a book called Making the World Work Better. They put together an exhibit that premiered at the Lincoln Center in New York. And then after the anniversary year, they donated it to the Epcot Center, where it could still create value for society and still get their name out there. And they also had leadership forums where they brought together thought leaders talking about the next 100 years and some of the biggest challenges facing society and how we can all work together across government, private sector, and NGOs to address these challenges of the future. But the point I'm making here is that none of these tactics unto themselves were particularly groundbreaking or innovative. What was innovative and really smart was how IBM went about creating them and executing them. So this was an organization that's obviously, positioned around building a smarter planet, and so their tactics really reflected that ethos. So we're going to stop there for a moment. I know we've got a couple of questions that have come in, Brittany. So we're going to take a quick break and answer some of these questions that have rolled in.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to ask the first question, and while Jason answers that, feel free to submit any more questions you'd like answered. Also, remember, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation as well. Great. So our first question, someone asked, we haven't really done anything in our with our history since the last anniversary, that was 25 years ago. I'm more worried about capturing the history of the last 10 years, which is what I think everyone's going to care about more and be more focused on. What do you have advice for how to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a good point, because oftentimes we find that capturing that more recent history and stories is far more difficult and complex, and certainly far more political than the earlier content that person refers to. So one of the things we'll actually share is how you can use some of the tactics building up to an anniversary and during an anniversary to actually create that content and engage people in the process. And there are a number of tools and methods you can use to create that kind of content. So we do everything from story sessions and oral histories to specific research, third-party research to kind of pull that together. But again, one of the advantages of building that bank of content, if you have the time to do so, like in the case of an IBM or a Lockheed Martin, is that content becomes sort of like a story brand book, if you will. It becomes content that's been approved, it's gone through legal, your executives are on board with it, and it becomes the consistent way you tell those stories. But it's a good question, because it can be challenging. Sometimes it's more, ironically, sometimes it's more challenging sort of capturing the history of the last 10 years than from the first 40 years or 90 years.
Great. And then one more question before we go back into the presentation. So with IBM, you mentioned a lot of different tactics, and you said choose a few tactics and do them well. But I have a lot of people with a lot of different opinions on what we should do for the anniversary. How do I please everyone without creating a headache for myself?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we often say sometimes what's as important as what you do is what you don't do, and having a point of view on why you didn't do it. So an example of that is we have many organizations who when they come to us say, they kind of assume they're going to do a book just because, and oftentimes that's actually ironically coming straight from the top. The CEO wants to do a book, and often case you can make the case on why you're not going to do that based on what your strategy is. Again, going back to that notion of vision and alignment. So the answer can be, based on what our goals are, based on, who we've decided to focus on, and some other considerations. These are the tactics that make sense, and these are the tactics that maybe don't meet that criteria. So you have to kind of have that set of criteria for what you do, and as importantly, what you don't do. So as an example, if your anniversary goals are to make sure that you're including everyone in a global organization, producing a book that can't necessarily easily be translated and distributed, may make the case that doing something digital makes more sense, as an example.
Cool. Sounds good. Well, with that, we'll dive back into the second half of our presentation.
Good. So another note here about the tactics, and in the spirit of some of those questions, is that another thing to consider as part of these tactical components is making sure that you include lots of engagement opportunities. You want to make sure that you're creating opportunities for people to be able to engage in the process and become part of the story. You don't want to just create communications that are one way. And I'm sure many of you are already doing that every day, but that's a really important, critical element, and it's probably one of the biggest things that I think has changed with anniversaries over the last 10 to 20 years or so. University Health is a healthcare system that this year is turned 200. And they're doing some great work down there. They're headquartered in Augusta, Georgia. And it's been very inclusive. This is a great shot of them getting some of their staff out on the lawn in front of their main hospital. They've done a great job of gathering stories to the point of that question that we just addressed a few minutes ago. They've created story gathering campaigns where they've engaged their staff, their patients' families, and then they've taken that content and they've pushed it out through a number of different tactics, including digital, as well as advertising and a number of other different channels. So it's been a great example of an organization that's really created a lot of opportunities for engagement, participation, and sharing. And the last thing I'll point out with respect to tactics is this, which is begin with what you're already spending time and money on and that that works. I think, again, one of the sort of instincts can be that organizations tend to immediately start looking at doing new things versus kind of focusing on what they're doing already and then enriching those and then adding additional tactics on top of the things you're already doing. So you want to leverage what you already have and what is going to work. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel just because of the fact that you're turning 25 or 50. You want to use it as an opportunity to try some new things, but you want to make sure that you don't forget the things that you have that you can really optimize. One of the great examples of this is the centennial of Zurich in North America. So this was not the company's 100th anniversary. This was Zurich's 100th anniversary of operations in North America. And one of the big focal points of their campaign was that they really wanted to reinforce the impact that Zurich has had in North America and on American infrastructure. And they had some interesting assets, which was they had this desk that they had kind of floating around the company for the last 80 years or so. And it was a desk that actually belonged to FDR. And I think they had lost track of why they even had this desk. But the story behind it was that FDR had actually worked for one of their predecessor companies. It was the only private sector job he ever had in his career. And it actually shaped a number of his perspectives on policy. And they had this desk and they had this great kind of, icon, this great golden nugget that connected them directly, obviously, to the American experience. So they used that desk as one of the key assets that kind of kicked off their anniversary. They donated the desk to FDR's presidential library and museum in Hyde Park. They did a big media play that kicked off on President's Day, which is a good day to do business press because the markets are closed. And then what they did was they then activated that and really focused on telling their story through those existing channels where they already spend a lot of resources. So they have things like the industry events like RIMS and the Council on Insurance Agents and Brokers. They have a big partnership with Habitat for Humanity. They do a lot with the PGA, with the Zurich Classic, which is obviously their golf event every year down in New Orleans. They already do a ton of advertising, so they created this campaign called We Helped Make It Happen, which reinforced this connection to American infrastructure with these iconic projects that they had been involved with over the last 100 years. So everything that they kind of did was built off of major assets and investments that they already had. So they literally, when you look at this calendar here, they basically built the year and kind of hung it off of some of the key events that they had, beginning with an internal leadership team meeting in Chicago, and then all the way through to some of the industry community events that they do. So as you can see from that example with Zurich, there can be a lot going on in an anniversary. But one of the things to keep in mind is that you can run the risk of anniversarizing people to death and over messaging it. And then conversely, you can also run the risk of underdoing it and maybe just focusing on, one day, which, the official birthday of the company, and kind of limiting the reach. So one of the tips that we've learned over the years is to build a narrative arc to your year. And this arc helps drive your editorial strategy for the year. It helps you configure the rollout of your programs and your tactics. And it really helps kind of, set that structure to make sure that you're not over or under communicating. An example of this is Huntington Bank. Huntington Bank started their anniversary with some pre-messaging before the anniversary year. They then kicked it off and essentially built an approach that was organized by quarter. So they started with a Q1 focus, which was largely internal, communicating and focusing on their employees, who they call colleagues. They then shifted it in the second quarter to their communities when they had some key events that they could tie in and dovetail with. Then in Q3, they went more of an external customer focus. They had some customer events that they do year in and year out that they optimized. And then in Q4, they brought the focus back in internally, and they had it more focused on the future and kind of the wrap up of the anniversary and our vision for the future. So that's a simple example, but it's a good way to show how you can kind of build a narrative arc to your year and focus on different audiences and different messages at different times of the year. And as you build that narrative arc, one of the things to keep in mind is that inclusion of CSR. I think one of the things that you're seeing in these examples is that almost all of these examples have organizations who have included a CSR component. You know, one of the natural subtexts of an anniversary is that you're proud of your milestone, but you don't want it to come off as, too kind of beating your own chest and too self-congratulating. So you want to make sure that there's a CSR element baked into your programming. That's important externally, and we found it's as important internally as well. And it's also just the right thing to do what we call celebrate your success by helping others succeed.
What does CSR mean for people who?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Corporate social responsibility.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah. Good question. So for their centennial, Boeing wanted to look ahead to the industry's next 100 years. And this meant helping to build the next generation of innovators and inventors. So to promote education and excitement around the aerospace industry, they launched 100 Days of Learning, an online classroom series featuring specially curated content co-created by their engineers for parents, teachers, and students with new themes that were rolling out each week. So the education series included a collection of lessons plans, videos, interactive media, and design challenges. So this is a great example of how an organization used its anniversary both to address some of the strategic challenges facing the organization and their industry, but also did it in a way where it was giving back to society. The other kind of aspect of the CSR or philanthropic dimension of an anniversary is it can also help with another challenge that many organizations face, which is making sure that the anniversary isn't too narrowly focused. We all, I'm sure, deal with that challenge of making sure that we're not talking to ourselves in the headquarters. And so you want to make sure that you're not too either HQ centric or for many of you who are working in large global organizations, making sure that you're not ignoring that global footprint that I know many of you have to manage. And so a key there is striking that balance of a strong centralized plan and resources with tools and the capacity for the field to tailor those tools and make them their own. So in fact, that was the central theme of Jack Daniel's presentation earlier this year at the Anniversary Marketing Summit. They created a global toolkit with assets. And what was interesting, what we learned about that presentation was that Jack Daniel's has always given a lot of autonomy to the local markets to kind of do whatever they need to do to be successful in their markets. And they've never really taken an approach where they have a centralized campaign and are then giving the tools and resources for the local markets to implement. And this was literally the first time they did that in a way that they felt like it kind of wrote a new playbook on how they implement at global scale while still being able to customize and tailor at the local market level. And so they did that by, again, creating a toolkit with assets, ideas, and tactical components that could be used or tailored within the brand guidelines. So they had gifts, pop-up exhibits, and VR experiences, advertising and in-store promotions and merchandising, and trade engagement that leveraged their local master distillers. And the campaign was all tied together globally with what they called an anchor tactic. And that anchor tactic was a global scavenger hunt, which they called a barrel hunt. They planted 150 Jack Daniel's barrels in 57 markets around the world. And as you can see here, they created a lot of engagement and activity around that anchor activation. Okay, and I think the last one we here have, okay, number 12, we made it. So the last thing we want to bring to your attention today is that anniversaries can garner a lot of interest. And some of you may be finding that there's a lot of different ideas, a lot of different opinions within your organization. And it can also sometimes create competing interests across the organization, quite frankly. And it's not one person's job. And even if it is, it requires a lot of cooperation and a lot of coordination. And so just like any other initiative, you need to apply some discipline and structure, or it's going to get really chaotic really quick. And for those of you who are, leading the effort for planning and implementation, if nothing else, just for your own sanity, you want to have a really strong operating model that engages your stakeholders and establishes clear lines of accountability. I think one of the things that we see over and over again with anniversaries is that by their nature, they happen every 25 years. And so as a result of that, organizations don't kind of have the sort of institutional muscle memory of knowing how they implement them the same way they know how to do an annual report or a new brand rollout or a sales meeting, because they do those things, every year. So this is an example of kind of the standard operating model that we use that leverages an executive sponsor, a steering committee, a working team, and then various work streams that are deploying and leveraging internal and external resources, depending obviously, what is appropriate given the scale and size of the organization and what exactly is being done as part of the anniversary.
So can this same model be used for a smaller organization that has typically maybe just one or two people on the team and then a few others they're working with? Is this be able to scale down or?
Yeah, I think, that's a good question. I think that it's still largely relevant because what's really reinforcing is clear lines of accountability and making sure that you are including and engaging the right people in the right way at the right time. Mm-hmm. So really, whether you're an organization of 100 people or 100,000 people, you have a lot of those same challenges of wanting there to be clarity of accountability and roles and responsibility. And again, one of the challenges with an anniversary is that just by its nature, it's a very time-bound initiative. Mm-hmm. It's not like at the end you're like, we did our 51st. So that alone, puts a little bit more pressure. And so having that operating model is really important. This is another example of that. It's conceptually very similar to the template we use. But this is the model that Karen and the team at Cargill deployed, and you can see here they had an executive sponsor and steering committees, and Karen was the quarterback, and then she had these different team leaders for different work streams, and so they had their digital work stream, they had an external content work stream, an internal content work stream, a thought leadership work stream, a employee celebration work stream. The existing programs they were optimizing, again, that idea of kind of building on what you have. And then they had this whole toolkit component of how they were then rolling it out to ambassadors and coordinators around the organization. So there you have it, the 12 things to keep in mind. And in the spirit of giving you just a few key takeaways to think about, the most successful anniversaries we see really share at least three common characteristics. And that first one, as we emphasized right up front, it's aligned with organizational goals. It's not just a birthday party. It's really helping the organization move forward and using this once-in-a-generation opportunity. Secondly, the tactics are well executed. You want to make sure that whatever it is you're doing, again, that mantra of, what's worth doing is worth doing well. So the tactics have to be well executed. And the third thing is that notion of storytelling and content. The story isn't that you're just turning 25 or 75. The story is really, what is it that you've done over the last 25 years or 100 years? And based on who you are today and where you're going, what content and what stories do you need to help reinforce that. And I think that that's an important point, because one of the natural aspects of an anniversary is that kind of continuum of past, present, and future. And when you look back, for a lot of organizations that are, 50, 75, or 100 years old, when you go back to that beginning, the characteristics may be the same, the DNA may be the same. There's a lot of values and great stories to pull forward, but the reality is that a lot of those stories are also not very diverse. They're, as we say, they can look a little old mill, pale and stale. And so how can you bring those stories forward and modernize them with new characters in your story that are, sounding like and looking like and reflecting a more diverse, organization and footprint. And so what we always kind of like to emphasize with that is our founder and CEO has a great saying that I have shamelessly stolen over the years, which is, you're not good because you're old because you're good. And so the opportunity isn't to kind of reinforce we're good because we've been around a long time. It's you've been around a long time because you've created value for your customers, your shareholders. You've been able to adapt and evolve in the marketplace to make it to this milestone. And presumably you're going to continue to do those right things in the future. So this is an opportunity to not celebrate that you're old, but to really celebrate the things that you've done that have enabled you to reach this point. So I know we're going to take some more questions here, but before doing that, we also just wanted to quickly share some additional resources. First, we want to emphasize to you that you're not alone. If you're feeling like you're kind of out on an island there with your anniversary, through the Anniversary Marketing Summit community, what we call the TAMS community, you can connect with other of your peers at other companies and brands that are going through this process and are planning and implementing their own anniversaries, as well as connecting with those who have already gone through the journey. As I mentioned before, we're going to share with you our Anniversary Framework Workbook, which is a planning tool that you can use to kind of stress test where you are in the process. We also have a monthly newsletter called Bridge, which is not a anniversary specific publication, but there's a lot of content in it that's valuable and helpful, and there's often a lot of content in it that is anniversary specific. I believe our last one was focused on anniversaries, so you can always find a lot of good content in Bridge if you sign up to receive that in your inboxes every month. And of course, you can contact me directly if you'd like to talk offline about where you are in the plan, budgeting, resourcing, content challenges. I'm certainly happy to arrange an offline conversation with any of you who are participating today. And then lastly, we'd love to see you in person next spring in Chicago. We will have our next Anniversary Marketing Summit event. It's a great event that brings in speakers and leaders from organizations who have already gone through the process and gives you the opportunity to hear from them directly, as well as other interesting thought leaders. We don't yet have a date set, but early in Q1 of 2019, we'll certainly have a date, which we expect will be in late April or in March late April or May for the Anniversary Marketing Summit. So.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, and as the event producer for Anniversary Marketing Summit, feel free to check us out at anniversarymarketingsummit.com, or you can check us out at historyfactory.com. Great. So it looks like we have some questions rolling in. So we're going to switch over and ask some Q&A. Thanks so much, Jason, for joining us today. And
thank you.
Giving your spiel.
Thank you.
Awesome. So let's start with some questions. And as Jason's answering, feel free to chat us in the chat window on the right-hand side if anything pops up. So the first question, how do you manage a 25-year anniversary for a parent company when some have been acquired companies it owns for more than 55 years? So it's the question of acquisitions and managing different histories, it seems. Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question and something that we deal with a lot. So let me see, make sure I'm processing this. How do you manage a 25-year anniversary for a parent company that some of the acquired companies have? Yeah, that's a great one. So, and actually, interestingly enough, the Stanley Black & Decker example is like that. So Stanley, the legacy company, is 175. They've got a number of operating companies and brands that are both older and younger. And so that is a challenge. There's no there's no one single right answer to that. It depends on essentially, the architecture of your operating companies and brands. But presumably, if many of those legacy companies have now been rolled up into the new company and you're operating as one unified company and brand, then there are some specific approaches that we take to acknowledging that heritage that you have behind you, while also staying true to the sort of master founding date of the parent company. But that is a complex issue that we see many times, and there's ways to nuance that. Because ideally what you want to do is you want to, number one, include and acknowledge and embrace those employees that have been part of those legacy institutions and acknowledge, their contribution. You also, at the same time, to some extent, want to sort of take credit for some of the milestones and innovations that those legacy companies had. But at the same time, you don't want to create confusion because you can't change your founding date every time you acquire a new company. So you have to have kind of a stake in the ground for how old your company is. But certainly in organizations and industries where there's a lot of M&A activity, that can become very complex.
Mm-hmm. Something we're familiar with. Great. So next question. We're a nonprofit celebrating 250 years in 2020. Congrats.
Wow.
And yeah, it's impressive. And don't have the same budget and resources as a corporation. Where should we focus our resources?
Yeah, a great question. And certainly, lots of organizations, if not all organizations, have to deal with, obviously, the budget and resource constraints. It's hard to answer that question in terms of what you should focus on, because I would say it really needs to be driven on what are your goals for the anniversary. So what I would encourage is, what are the goals that you want to accomplish? And then based on those goals, what are the few things that you would do? But I think back to some of the points I was making earlier, when you have a limited time or limited budget or both, you want to, again, focus on a lot of those things that you're already doing and how you can optimize those. So if you've got a 250th in 2020, what are the things you're already going to be doing in 2020 that you can really optimize and get the most bang for your buck with? And then how can you complement and augment those with a couple of key things that you do, and really really hold true to that notion of do a few things and do them really well, so you can maximize that impact versus doing a bunch of things but not being able to do them as well because of limited spend.
Great, makes sense. So the next question, tag along as well about nonprofits. With a nonprofit, do you have any tips on getting corporate support for the anniversary?
Well, yeah, I think for a nonprofit looking to get support, you really have to align it with the mission of the organization that you're pursuing. So if you're a nonprofit and you're looking to get support from a corporate or for-profit partner, you want to find opportunities where your mission and what you're trying to accomplish is really aligned with their mission. Corporations over the last couple decades have, I think, become largely far more sophisticated and focused on how they spend their dollars with respect to supporting foundations. Many of the clients we work with, historically, their giving efforts were not being driven by a unified strategy. And particularly as companies and brands have become far more strategic and focused on defining their purpose and their role in society, and that is something that's increasingly expected of them, of their shareholders, their customers, and their employees. They're aligning the kinds of nonprofits they partner with that purpose. And so I guess what I would say is look at organizations. If you have some specific targets in mind, make sure that there's a good natural fit. And in addition to that, look at organizations that have a very defined strategy that that aligns with your organization's mission. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. And then also with for-profit, is there anything else you'd recommend, or probably similar strategies? I'm
sorry, I didn't follow that. Sorry.
So for any leader who's not sure if it's worth the investment,
Yeah.
whether it's for profit or not, is there a way of going about that to make a case for it?
Okay, so the question, what do you say to a leader who's not sure it's worth the time, effort, and cost to celebrate an anniversary?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, the first thing we would say is, okay, maybe it isn't. Let's explore that and talk through, why that may not be the case. Having said that, I think there's two things there. Number one, we found that leaders are often the most guilty of being overly tactical. And they tend to already kind of have in their head like what they think they may want for the anniversary, or they've already, they're on the board of some other group and they like their event or the book they got or whatever. So they often are the first to kind of commit the crime of being overly tactical. Mm-hmm. So the first thing to do is to demonstrate how the anniversary is really going to be an initiative that is dovetailing with the strategic direction of the company and how it can be used as a lever to help accelerate those priorities, and is kind of a once-in-a-generation opportunity for us to take advantage of if we do it the right way. So that's one notion. I think the second notion is also, so what message does it send if we don't do that? And certainly, years ago during the Great Recession, many organizations were dealing with that issue of, how much do we want to do? But the realization was, well, what message are we sending to our people if we're not acknowledging and embracing and celebrating this milestone? So there are consequences for not doing something as well. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, depending on what kind of organization you are, one other thing we've found is that for many organizations, if it's not something that is embraced by leadership, oftentimes it'll happen anyway. We've seen, particularly in organizations with strong cultures, in those rare instances where the leadership hasn't wanted to make a big fuss of it. Many times, folks in the organization have gone rogue and they've created their own anniversary campaigns. So if there's a concern it's going to happen anyway, then you may as well, you at least want to stay ahead of it and be able to control it and harness it. Otherwise, you're going to be vulnerable to whatever then you're leaving your people to do on their own without the guidelines and expectations.
Sure. Great. Awesome. Couple more questions we have rolling in. What is the most impactful low budget activity you've ever seen as part of an anniversary celebration?
Hey, great question. I'm not dodging the question, but I would say it really depends on what it is you're trying to accomplish. So, in terms of low budget, again, that idea of optimizing some things you're already doing is helpful, but I think the idea of finding some creative hooks, and one of the things that I've always liked is examples of organizations who have low budgets who figure out a way to essentially hack someone's bigger budget. So depending on what kind of organization you are, is there a way that you can use your anniversary to piggyback on somebody else's budget and what they're doing? And one of my favorite stories of that of all time was there was a winery in California that years ago was a tiny winery. Now it's a really big winery, by the way. I'm not going to disclose their name, but they wanted to use their anniversary as a way to kind of put themselves on the map. So what they did was they hosted an award ceremony for California wines. And they invited all of the big major players in the industry, the Mondavis and the Gallos. And they brought in these big players in the industry who were receiving these awards, and they were recognizing them and celebrating them as being pioneers. And they brought in their, PR, resources, and they used that as a way to kind of piggyback onto others' efforts. And I always thought that was just an incredibly clever tactic where they were able to literally ride on the coattails of bigger brands. And then everyone kind of recognized that they had a really great quality product and it created great engagement opportunities for them. So that conceptually, the way I would answer that is if you can find those kind of clever ways to sort of hack into another organization's budget and resources and platforms, that might be a fun thing to try to do.
Yeah, and similarly, if you're working with internal resources, if someone else in another department already has buy-in for the anniversary, you can dovetail the anniversary efforts with what they're working on. So part of their budget can go towards the anniversary, whether it's events, promotion, digital.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it can both be with external partners or internally.
Absolutely. Great point.
Great. Okay. Next question. Should an anniversary be focused on a single day, month, or as long as a year?
Great question. I would say that our standard answer on that would be typically a year. And, and we talked about this notion of building that narrative arc. We find that one day is not enough. And there are oftentimes, depending on what kind of organization you are, it can become challenging because if you're global and you've got different places and different time zones and all of that. So typically, we like the idea of creating a campaign that if you are in the position to do so, you can start some messaging and activations before the anniversary year. Then there's programs that play out over the course of the anniversary year. Again, using that kind of idea of a narrative arc, so you're doing different things and talking to different audiences. But typically, to the point of that question, there is kind of a crescendo or climax where you may have like a New York Stock Exchange event or your Founders Day. And that's the day when you're going to garner media attention and you're going to stroke a check to an NGO partner. So you definitely can have that kind of big day where you build a lot of activation around it. But you want to have kind of a build up to that and then have things happening afterward. And then another point that we always like to emphasize is whatever it is you build and create during your anniversary, again, that example of IBM and the exhibit that they then donated to Epcot, ideally, if you can build some tools and resources that you can then get some mileage out of after the anniversary year, maybe you take off some of the anniversary branding so it's not quite as time-stamped, but whether it's some new tools for training or sales or onboarding, a lot of the resources that get built during the anniversary year can then be repurposed, and you can get a few more years of mileage out of them to reinforce kind of the ROI. But yeah, we like anniversaries to not just be kind of a quick sort of flash in the pan.
Great. So we have about 5 more minutes left. We have a few more questions rolling in, so we'll get to them. Next question. What are your thoughts on a press release to announce the anniversary? Have you found it to be effective?
Yeah, the short answer is probably not, unless, again, there's a specific hook. And again, it's what kind of press are you looking to garner? So typically, when you look at the way organizations are leveraging media, they're typically using the anniversary as the occasion to do something. So they're making an announcement about a new initiative or a new product, or they're reinforcing their values and are standing behind that with a commitment on the philanthropic front. So it depends on, again, what you're trying to accomplish. But if the idea is kind of just a pure kind of press play, putting on a press release that we're turning 75, that is not normally the most effective way to go about that. You want to have some sort of angle or hook. But we'd be happy to talk to you offline about how you might want to approach that and leverage media.
That makes sense. Great. Cool. Next question. Our school will be celebrating 200 years in 2022. Congrats, that's great. We'll see this as an opportunity to bring much needed clarity to our brand, but not everyone agrees on the positive elements of the brand. So how do you bring the school community together to rally around a united theme?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we've seen that particularly in academic institutions where there's a lot of opinions. We've seen that as a challenge, and I think one point to make is that just because you're having an anniversary, it's not going to solve and be a silver bullet for organizational challenges you already have. So if you're turning 200 and you're already having some of those challenges with brand clarity, I think the anniversary can be used as a tool to help with that, but it's not going to necessarily solve all those challenges you have with building that internal vision and alignment. So again, going back to the beginning of our session today, we talked about the importance of that vision and alignment. What is good, though, is that you've got some time and runway to do that work. And I do think what an anniversary can do, and what we've found consistently with organizations that are using an anniversary to help pivot the brand of the organization, is that it creates an opportunity for you to really celebrate and reinforce the values of the organization and pull forward those authentic stories. And so, again, it's kind of a quick answer, but there might be the opportunity there to really do some sort of internal soul searching in terms of what does the organization stand for, how has this been proven over our 200 years of rich history, and how can we really stand behind this positioning and support that positioning with these kinds of stories that we have. And especially in an organization like an academic institution where real news and facts still matter. I think using that kind of substance to ground the brand in truth can be really effective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sounds
if
like
that
just
makes sense.
Sherwin-Williams, how they
Right.
quote.
Yeah. Right.
Great. Sounds good. Great. So it actually seems like we've hit the hour mark. Thank you everyone for attending. If you still have any questions, feel free to email Jason directly at jdressel@historyfactory.com. Also, feel free to visit us at historyfactory.com or our anniversarymarketingsummit.com to get more resources. Following this event, if you want to replay, share this also with a coworker who might be interested. We'll be sending out a replay link, as well as a link to download the ebook for the anniversary framework that you can use as a tool for planning your anniversary. Again, thank you everyone for joining, and good luck with planning. We're excited to see where everyone goes.
Thanks, everyone.